never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.
We're talking today with John Damon of Grand Rapids, Michigan, and the interviewer is James Smither of the Grand Valley State University Veterans History Project. Now, John, can you begin with some background on yourself? To start with, where and when were you born?
Well, I was born in Grand Rapids, Michigan, 91 years and several months ago, and I graduated from Creston High School in Grand Rapids.
Okay. Now, when you were growing up, what did your family do for a living?
Well, it's a rather tragic story. My father was an Army major. My mother was an Army nurse in World War I. And we lived in Elmhurst, Illinois for a while. And my father was a stockbroker. And like several of them today, he misinvested. And he went to prison in Illinois for embezzlement. And I never saw him again. My mother, we came back to Grand Rapids and established our home here. My mother's brother, Aaron Van Stensel, was a real estate man here. And he became my surrogate father, you might say. And I never heard, many years later, my aunt, my mother's sister, was at the county clerk's office, or treasurer's office, and Colonel Donovan was the county clerk here. And Colonel Donovan brought an American Legion magazine in to my aunt and said there was an Edward E. Damon listed as a decedent. And he said, I wonder if this could be Cap Damon. And I gave it to me. I called the Legion post in Easton, Pennsylvania, and I told the man my name. I said my father's name was Edward E. Damon, and I haven't heard or seen from him for 25 plus years, and I wondered if this could be my father. He said, I can tell you right now, it is. You sound exactly like him on the phone.
Wow.
So he had an accounting business, and he died in Easton, Pennsylvania, but I never saw him again. Mm-hmm. So that was the story there.
Yeah. All right. Now, you graduated from Creston High School, and then what did you do after that?
Well, I worked for a year on construction work, and then I went to junior college. And I graduated from junior college. I never played ball in high school because I had to work. Mm-hmm. And Harold Steele was a coach at junior college then.
A football coach? Or?
Yeah, football and basketball, both. And he saw me, and I was back much bigger then than I am now. And he talked me into going out. And as a result of that, we had some pretty good teams at junior college. And I got an athletic scholarship to the Citadel, which is a military college in South Carolina. And I went there for 3 years, so I had 2 years of junior college. And back in those days, a junior college graduate could play 3 years of varsity. Mm-hmm. Now they only have 2, but they redshirt them the first year. And so I played football and basketball.
Now, when did you go down to the Citadel?
In 1939.
Okay.
I'm 39 and I graduated in 43.
All right. Now, so you were at the Citadel when Pearl Harbor happened?
That's right.
Okay, so how did you hear about that?
Well, I was up, we got 3 weekends a year. Citadel's a military school, and I went up to northern South Carolina with one of my friends to his home for a weekend. And I came back and the cadets were marching off to the evening mess. We marched to all our meals and everything. And they were chanting, beat Japan, Japan, beat the hell out of Japan. I said, what is going on here? Because I had registered for the draft in South Carolina, and my deferment request was up for consideration. And I said, there goes my deferment. And sure enough, they called me, and they wouldn't give me a deferment because I had to take the final 2 years of my military program the following year, and I was not in the advanced military. And so that was I resigned from the Citadel and came home I transferred my induction up here to Kalamazoo so I wouldn't have to go back to South Carolina. And I wound up in the Navy.
All right. Now tell me this. You told me the story before we went in here. How did you wind up in the Navy out of all that?
Well, I'm a pretty strong Calvinist, Jim. Nothing happens by chance. I had no intention of going in the Navy, but a friend of mine that I played ball with at junior college he said he was going down to Grosse Ile to try to get in the Naval Air Corps. He said, would you like to go with me? I was going to be inducted in a couple of weeks. I said, I've got nothing else to do, so I went with him. And all these fellows from the local colleges and that running around half naked. And a Navy lieutenant came up to me and he said, because I was not running, he said, what are you doing? I said, well, sir, I've been drafted. He said, well, what were you doing? And I said, well, sir. I said, sir, that's my military school. I said, I was a cadet at the Citadel. He said, you mean they drafted you from the Citadel? He'd been in the Charleston Navy Yard. I said, yes, sir. He said, would you like to go in the Navy? I said, well, I haven't given it a thought. He said, well, we have a program. You can sign up with us if you can pass the exams and that. You can go back to school and finish, and when you finish, we'll call you up. I said, you sure I can go back to school? Yes, you can. I said, what do I do? He says, go in there and take your clothes off. So I went in there, got naked like the rest of them, and then later got dressed. He came to me, he said, well, John, we can sign you up. I said, well, sir, you sure I can go back to school? Yes, you can. I said, okay. I said, well, what did I tell the draft board? He said, tell them to go to hell. Well, I signed up, went back to Charleston, made up my exams because I dropped out, went down to the draft board to report and the draft board clerk was furious. Did you tell them that you'd been drafted? I said, yes, sir, I did. He said, well, what did they tell you? I said, sir, they told me to tell you to go to hell. And I walked out, and that was it. And then I finished a year at the Citadel. I graduated in June. I was called up to Columbia University in August of that year.
All right. Now, tell me a little bit about what the military aspects were of life at the Citadel. What sort of training did you get there?
Well, it's pretty rugged. We were at bed at night at 10, up every morning at 6, 15 minutes to get down in the quadrangle. We lived in what we called barracks, but they were big stone. And we marched to all of our meals and everything. And we'd go to morning breakfast and back to our rooms, and we'd have to clean up our room, make up our bunks and sots and everything, get ready. And then we'd go to classes. And we would march into our classes. We'd form outside the building and march in. I was in political science, and my group of about 10 cadets in that group, there were 2 governors of South Carolina, 1 United States senator, and 1 ambassador to Saudi Arabia. And so the Citadel is quite well known down there. But it was very strict. We had room inspections, and we had drill, and there was just, well, you didn't have any uprisings at the Citadel. The president of the Citadel when I was there was General Summerall, who was a retired chief of staff of the United States Army. When you have a president of a school like that, neither the students or the faculty rebel. And
right.
So.
Did you have any trouble there because you were from the North?
Well, when you're there the first year, they really brace you. I had fellows 5'6", 5'8", bracing me, and they'd say, "Who won the War of the Northern Aggression, mister?" I said, "The South did, sir." "You damn right, and don't you ever forget that." But that was 60 years ago, 65 years ago, and the South is advanced economically and that very far from that. But they were still, it was a war of the Northern Aggression.
It still is, at least down there. All right. So after the first year, though, you get better established. You're now really part of the
Well,
group.
you're under regulation till the last couple weeks. And you, as a fourth classman, that's what they called. By the way, they shaved all your hair off. But we had four stories in our barracks, and all cement. And you had to go the outer 1 foot of the steps, and you had a double time up and double time down. And when you got on the quadrangle for formation, you had to stand there at attention, and the upperclassmen would come by and scream in your face and shout at you. It was all done so you could learn to restrain yourself, no matter what it wasn't just a fraternity type of stuff. There was a purpose behind it. Well, like the Marine boot camp. And we marched to our meals, and we had to sit, the fourth class, we had to sit on the forward 4 inches of our chair and brace until they put us, we couldn't eat anything without, they sat you at the table by your rank, and the senior cadet, one would be at each end, there'd be 12 at the table, one at each end, and as a fourth classman, if you couldn't take anything, you'd had to offer, would you care for more meat, sir? Would you, and no, go ahead. And we had milk, and they pound their glass on the table 3 times and throw it, and you had to catch it and fill it, but you didn't throw it back to them. And the upperclassmen, you call them Mr. Smithers, and they call it Mr. Damon, never John and that. Mm-hmm. And so it was that level. It was very strict. We had to fold our laundry. Everything had to be in a certain order in the room, a certain size, and we had each had a rifle. It didn't have a firing pin, but we had to polish and clean that rifle. Oh, it never been fired. We had Saturday morning room inspection. They'd officers, Army officers, come around with white gloves on, put their hand above the door on the pinner, and go on report. And but my roommate, he was a very, very committed cadet. In fact, when he retired, he was President of Blue Cross of California. Mm-hmm. He just died last summer. But it's very strict, and the cadets discipline, and you got rank. You got the senior cadets and the down rank, and you just didn't talk back.
Right. Now, eventually, of course, you become a senior cadet.
Oh, yes.
And what was that like for you?
Well, I was a lieutenant. I only had 3 years, and I had a platoon, and I organized, and I had, well, that was it. And of course, I was not in a lot of the drills because I played football mm-hmm. and basketball. So but that was it. All of the cadets, from the cadet colonel down, and there was this pretty rigid structure, Army type. Mm-hmm. Well, the president, as I say, was a retired general, and we had Army officers. Just to illustrate, the barracks were cement, and one night some SOB threw a light bulb out on the quadrangle after taps. Well, in the Army, if you didn't want to tell who did it, all 400 of us in that barracks went out, and we marched around Hampton Park, which is on the edge of for an hour in the dark. And we came back, another SOB threw another light bulb, and we went out again. But that's the military way. If you don't want to tell who did it, okay, the whole company, in this case, a whole battalion, mm-hmm. 400 fellows marching around in the dark for an hour.
Now, in that kind of situation, would the unit eventually figure out who did it and take care of him themselves?
Pardon?
Well, would you find out who did it and deal with him privately?
You would.
Well, you wouldn't tell on the guys who threw the bulb.
No.
You didn't turn them in, but did you discipline each other?
Well, if they knew who did it, see, but the cadet officers wouldn't know. And usually the cadet officers were supposed to be of that type of thing. Well, at the last year there, they called up all the senior ROTC to Fort Jackson in Columbia, South Carolina. And they made me a battalion commander of the non-military. And the battalion, I had a barracks, and so these guys, of course, they get kind of stir crazy sometimes, and they made a mess, threw everything out in a quadrangle. So I ordered the gates locked, and I put them out there before the officers even got there, and I made them out there and clean, and we were cleaning. And I'll say this, I don't say this to brag, but one of the officers, see, I only had 3 years, so I was not rated higher, but he said, we made a mistake. We should have rated him much higher, because they were impressed that I, as a cadet, took over and administered the discipline, and the men were out there and cleaning up so that was what we were supposed to do.
Right. Okay. So now you graduate from the Citadel in 43.
Yes.
And then they send you up to Columbia University in New York.
2 months.
Yeah.
I was out for 2 months. In fact, during that 2 months, I drove semi-trailers.
Okay.
If you could breathe, they'd let you drive because they didn't have any drivers. And I'd haul stuff down to Detroit and around.
Wow. Okay. Now, did you go back home to Michigan to do that, or when you were?
Oh, yes.
Yeah. Okay.
I came back to Grand Rapids.
So you go home for a while.
Oh, 2 months,
Yeah,
yes.
2 months, and then you go to Columbia.
New York City.
Okay. Then what did you do there?
Well, started all over again, but the officers that were drilling the new midshipmen could see that I knew my left foot from my right foot. So they gave me the awkward squad. That's the fellows that didn't know their left foot from their right foot. And I drilled them. Well, then they gave me a whole platoon, and I stood in the center of the area, the parade ground, and I marched that platoon around and never moved. I just stood there, and I kept time with my toes and called out my commands. That was my Citadel background. As a result, they made me a midshipman battalion commander, and I had 4 companies of midshipmen underneath me. And my Citadel background was very important in doing that.
Right. Now, aside from training men to march and so forth, what other kind of training were you getting at Columbia?
Well, mostly it was basics. You don't have stairs. In the Navy, you have ladders. You don't have floors, you have decks. And, and learning the terminology. Right. And they had a old battleship moored on the Hudson River called the Prairie State. And we would go down there, and it was very superficial. And it was just a 4 months course. And that's why I call it 90-day wonders.
Right.
But it was, you march and you learn Navy terminology and that sort of thing. And then we went, they had a factory in New York City where they manufactured these computer directors, and we'd go there. And just very superficial.
All right. So most of what you really needed to know, you'd have to learn after you had an assignment?
Yeah, well, I was blessed, again, my Citadel background, I got some honors. And I was assigned to the USS Alaska, which wasn't even been at sea yet, and most of the reserves were going into what we called the Dungaree Navy, the landing craft, the amphibs and that. And because of my ratings, I guess, I was assigned very unusual, because mostly fellows assigned to the ships like the Alaska were Annapolis grads.
Right.
And so I was assigned to the USS Alaska.
Okay. Now, tell me a little bit about the Alaska. What kind of ship was it? And
Well, it was a beautiful ship. But only a Navy man would call a ship beautiful. But the Alaska was first of its class, CB-1, and it was designed to counter the German pocket battleship. It was faster than a battleship, and it had 12-inch guns, whereas the battleship had 16-inch main battery, and the battleships were more heavily armored. But we had a top speed of, in human language, almost 40 miles an hour. You can imagine a ship almost 900 feet long, 3 football fields, going at 40 miles an hour. And
was that land miles or was that knots?
well, I can't recall.
Because I think in the statistics it said 38
knots are somewhat less than a mile.
No, they're longer.
I say miles, but a knot is something a little less than that.
It's
probably about 35 knots or something
Actually,
like that.
I think it's, so the total number of knots is lower, but I think it said 38 knots and 50 miles an hour or something
But
like
if
that.
I say knots, people won't remember, so I just say about 40 miles an hour. And I can't even remember a knot now. Those are things that I learned, but you don't retain
The point
it.
is, it's faster than a battleship. It's got more punch than a regular heavy cruiser does.
Oh yeah, the heavy cruisers were 8-inch guns, and the light cruisers 6-inch.
Now, how big was a shell from a 12-inch gun?
Well, 12-inch
That's the diameter.
diameter. Yeah.
But in terms
They were all mechanically loaded. You couldn't load them, and we had 9. The Alaska had 9 12-inch guns, 2 turrets forward with 3 guns each, and 1 turret aft with 1 gun. By the way, aft is Navy. 1 turret aft with 3 guns.
Right.
I was a 5-inch 38 gunnery officer. The 5-inch 38s, it was a 5-inch shell, and we were used mainly for anti-aircraft. And along with the 40 millimeters, we had 6 mounts of 2 guns each of 5-inch 38s, 3 forward and 3 aft, and we had the directors forward and a director aft, and we had about 5 of us in the director, and the guns were. We would aim either by telescope or by radar night on the target, and that would be transmitted down to the control room where the computers and directors and everything were. They didn't have computers, then it was electric. And then that signal would go back up to the turrets, and the turrets were controlled electrically. The men weren't controlling those. And then all we did was manually we would either focus the radar or the telescope at daytime, with a telescope out there, and that would be the way. And the 5-inch 38 shell, you didn't have to have a direct hit. It had what they called a proximity fuse. If you got within 60 or 80 feet, it would explode.
Yeah, and for anti-aircraft in particular, that's important because it can blast a whole area.
Pardon?
Well, that works well for anti-aircraft fire. The proximity fuse for anti-aircraft?
Yeah.
Yeah, that you were talking about the big
aircraft.
blast.
Yeah. They didn't use the 5-inch 38s for any sharp purposes, because your 12-inch was your main battery for that.
Okay, now where physically on the ship was your battle station?
Well, it was on the aft 5-inch 38 director, and it was a room for 6 of us inside. The senior officer and a backup officer and a man on the radar and a man on the scope, and it was either 5 or 6 in that. And that was, we would steer that. Of course, it was electrical motors, and that would be steered from inside by they're taking their, they're getting on target, and they would, when they aim the telescope, that would turn the turret to the director.
So you're sort of in the superstructure, you're above
Well,
the
we
main
were
deck?
about 50 feet above the deck.
Okay. All right. So now, what was the situation of the Alaska when you joined her?
Well, it was still in Bayonne, New Jersey, and it was moved over to Philadelphia Navy Yard for final outfitting. In that time, we lived ashore in the barracks. That's another story, but a friend of mine, fellow officer, Lud Walgren from up in Minnesota, we went down to the reserve officers' quarters, see if we could get some place ashore. And the woman at the USO thing said, well, we have this one lady, she wants to do something for the boys in the service, and she has an apartment in the Sheraton Hotel. And you can go, she's an old lady, you can go. Well, we went there, and she was an heiress of the trust company, and it was a whole floor of the upper penthouse of the Sheraton. And Lud and I, we lived there for 2 months almost, and she had a maid, and they'd make up our bunk, and there was a piece of chocolate on our bunk at night, at bed, and she would take us to these Broadway shows that were opening in Philadelphia and she was just so pleased to have these 2 young Navy officers as her escort, gigolos, and then she'd take us backstage and introduce us to the theater. We had some of the fellows that were married come over with their wives, and their wives were just flabbergasted. How did you? So we didn't. Well, anyway, that was our accommodations.
Yeah, that was good duty.
Yeah.
All right. So then, when was it that the ship first goes out to sea then?
Well, it was probably. You got the log there.
You got the log there.
I think
I guess you got a shakedown cruise in July of *44.
Yeah.
Okay. Tell me about that.
Well, you go on a shakedown cruise, and they put the ship through everything, gunning and all that. And we went on a shakedown cruise with the Missouri, and we have all sorts of technicians on board because the ship is basically, it was electrical and mechanical. And so then for example, the ship would be going full speed ahead, all engines full speed ahead, and then all engines full speed astern. That was the way you stopped it. And that ship was about 3 football fields long, would gradually slow down, and pretty soon that fantail, the aft, would be bouncing out of the water. We had 4 propellers. Each of them was 18 feet propellers. And that ship, I got a picture there of the wake, though. We had quite a wake when and then we did all, going full speed ahead, rudder hard right. That's it total. And so it would take us over a mile to turn, and then rudder hard left. Everything was tested. And then they made notes, and they went back to the Navy Yard afterward. We had our shakedown at Guantanamo, and then when we went back to the Navy Yard to correct the deficiencies and whatever they saw, the ship was just put through. Well, I guess they do the same thing with automobiles and things today. The testing.
Yeah, because in the chronology for the ship here, it says you leave Philadelphia July 29th, you get to Norfolk on August 6th, and then a few days later you go to the Caribbean, you're down as far as Trinidad, and then you come back to Philadelphia, get refitted, go back via Guantanamo, and then by December you hit the Panama Canal.
Yeah, we left then, and we went down through the Panama Canal and up to San Francisco.
Now, how tight a fit was the ship in the canal?
Oh, it's hard to say, Jim. It was a few feet on each side. But we could run a 900-foot ship through the canal locks.
All right. So you get through the canal, and then you're out in the Pacific, and then
Yeah, we went up to San Francisco, and they did some more maintenance and whatnot. Then we left San Francisco for the Pacific.
all right. So what's your first stop then in the Pacific?
Well, Hawaii, and took on more provisions there and refueled and whatever.
Right. Now the chronology here says that Admiral Nimitz himself came out and inspected the ship.
Well,
Do you remember that, or?
well, he probably had, but I was standing at attention somewhere. I was just an ensign then.
So you kind of didn't know quite what was going
Well,
on.
it was a novelty in the Navy. Admiral Nimitz had never seen a battle cruiser.
Yeah.
So it was a learning experience for him, too.
All right. Then having been inspected there, you head out to sea, and now where do you go?
Well, boy, when you get out in the Pacific, Jim, all you see, water's water. But we joined, and I'm not sure, the naval base in the South Pacific out there was Leyte, which is in the Philippines. And we joined up with what the Alaska was. All of the surface ships were accompanying the carriers. The carriers were they didn't have any armament at all. In fact, they were floating gas cans. They had this high-octane gas. And we provided the anti-aircraft protection. The carriers would have 80, 90 planes on them each. And our task force would have 3 or 4 carriers. And all these cruisers and destroyers and battleships would surround them to protect, put up an air screen.
Right. Now this is early 1945 now
Yeah.
we've gotten to. What kind of missions were the carriers performing?
Well, our first action was the carrier strikes on Tokyo. That was our first action, and as I recall. Now, we were a couple hundred miles out, and the the planes were launched, and then they came back, and a lot goes on. You know, you're in a several hundred-mile radius there, but we did considerable amount of damage in Tokyo. We weren't going after, like these terrorist bombers today, we weren't going after schools and whatnot. We were going after infrastructure, power plants and whatnot. But we caused quite a few fires, and I'm sure that many civilians were killed. There's just no way you can conduct a war today, or even then, without hitting the civilians. Like London was bombed, and you know, Paris and Berlin.
Yeah. Well, there were some of those campaigns, the civilians were part of the target, but that wasn't what an ensign on a battle cruiser is responsible for.
No.
Now, from your end on that first trip off of Japan, did Japanese aircraft or kamikazes find your fleet?
The Japanese Navy was pretty well decimated by the time the Alaska got out there. But we did have the kamikazes. And they, of course, would dive into and the pilots would go down. It's like these terrorists today, only you'll just be one pilot.
Yep.
And so we relied to a great extent on the combat air patrol planes up there to intercept them long before they got near. But when they came up, there was a tremendous sheet of steel going out there, shells and that. Well, the Alaska, you know, you had all these 5-inch 38s in the Missouri and all of them, and they would throw up a real barrage. And so you couldn't tell. We took credit for planes that were shot down, but it's hard to say that we did, but others were involved too.
Now, a question here. When you've got all of these ships in the fleet, they're firing all of this ammunition up in the air. Most of it's going to come down again.
But it goes 20, 30 miles.
Okay.
When you're up in the air, that shell's going to land fell 15 miles away if it doesn't hit anything.
And the ships are far enough apart
Oh, yeah.
so
Well,
that usually...
we're within 1,000 feet of each other. we're steaming pretty close.
Okay, so the spent rounds don't just come back down on top of the decks?
They won't. You're not shooting straight up.
Okay. 'Cause I guess if you were, it would be a little too late.
Yeah.
All right, as far as that goes.
If you were, it'd be more safe to be the target rather than the shooter.
Right. Okay. So your first sort of taste of actual combat action, essentially, is that kind of work. Now, you also went to Iwo Jima at some point?
Well, yes. Again, it was just to support, air support. We were not supporting close up,
Okay.
like with artillery. And the air support, we were not using. We did some naval bombardment. But in the China Inland Sea, we didn't do any on Iwo Jima, that.
Okay. Because your job was still protecting the carrier task forces.
That was it, yes.
Yeah.
And they were always out 100 miles, 80, 100 miles out away from the...
Right. Okay. Now, where else did you sail to while the war was still going on? Where else did you do sorties?
Well, we were mainly involved in Iwo Jima and that area, and the carrier strikes on Tokyo, and then we made a sweep up the China Inland Sea, but there was no merchant ships or anything. Well, it was funny. There was one little Chinese fishing boat, and there's all these huge navies. And this little Chinaman up there waving an American flag.
So there really weren't many Japanese merchants.
Shot at.
Yeah, weren't many Japanese merchant ships left to shoot at. Then.
Yeah, we didn't. There wasn't any shipping.
Did you ever encounter any Japanese submarines?
No, no. The destroyers were involved there. That was the destroyer's main function. They had the depth charges and the sonar and that.
Okay. And then, did you do any shore bombardment any place?
Well, we did one. I can't recall where, but you know, when you're doing that, you don't know. They claim they hit something, but I'll tell you, the Navy is very impersonal. At least, it's not like the infantry where you're man to man. And even when the planes come in, you're shooting at a plane, not a human being. Although I do remember one time a Japanese pilot evacuated, parachuted, and they opened up, the Navy 20 millimeters net opened up on him. And well, it would be, somebody would be court-martialed today for doing that. But normally it was like we had over 2,000 men on board, and every man had a duty, and it was a ship and not an individual thing. And just like at a hospital, you go to the hospital, there's all these different people that treat you, and the Navy, the ship was a unit. It was not a human, it was a mechanical unit, but manned by human beings. But it was not a personal combat. You really, unless your ship got hit, you really didn't have any real exposure to damage or anything.
Right. Now, on a little bit different angle, what was your daily routine when you were on the ship, when you're out in the Pacific?
Well, you have watch sections, and you go on watch 4 hours. Then, if you're in combat zone, you're on watch all the time. But you go on watch for 4 hours, and you go off for 4 hours. You go on for 4 hours, and so your watch section, and when you were now with the men, they were scraping and painting. They repainted the ship. I don't know how many times, you know, and cleaning and that. And with the officers, we didn't really do a whole lot. You know, it was, but I stayed. I was up with the men. when my men were working in that, I was around with them, and not fraternizing as such, but that was part of my Citadel background. I was with those men, and so that the officers, the gunnery officers, and that our main duty was just when we were in battle station. We didn't have any assigned duties other than, well, we did have training. We had training in loading. Now the 5-inch 38s were hand loaded. The shell was put in, and the shell had the explosive in it too. The 12-inch guns, the shell was separate and the explosive was put in, and it was all put in mechanically. But we did have that, and we practiced. We would practice. They'd put up targets and tow and shoot at that, some of that. But when you're in a combat zone, you didn't do that.
All right. Now, did you have different kinds of shells for a 5-inch gun, or were they all anti-aircraft?
Well, ours was anti-aircraft because our 12-inch were the main battery, and the 12-inch were not used for anti-aircraft. They were the surface guns, 5-inch, and the 40 millimeters and 20 millimeters. We had 40 millimeter mounts with 4 guns on each mount, and that was, and then we had 20 millimeters were single guns, and they were all just aircraft. But the 5-inch 38, I assume, could have been used for surface purposes, but with the 12-inch guns, that was the main battery. Now the destroyers just had 5-inch 38s.
Yeah. And so they would use them for everything.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Okay. Now, how well does the Navy take care of its officers? Do you get fed separately
Well,
and that kind of
that's
thing?
an embarrassing question. I had a bunk, a room. I had 2 Annapolis graduates were my roommates. We had stewards mates. Just about all of the blacks on board were stewards mates. They made up our bunks. They cleaned up our rooms. They did all that. All we did was fold the bed clothing back and get in bed and put it. Oh, it's a second. I'm going to end it. That's my cleaning lady.
All right. So you now.
Well, you're, and then when we had, we called our mess, our room, and I've got a blank now, the wardroom, where we ate tables. We had black service at the table, white tablecloths, and on the Alaska, once a week, our dessert was baked Alaska. And so I don't feel very heroic about my time in the service.
Right. Now, at the time, did it strike you as kind of odd that we were only using black servicemen as servants on the ships, or was that just kind of normal at that time?
We had one black on ship who was a fireman down in the engine room. And no, because of course, my background at the Citadel, I was all whites. And I played ball against South Carolina and Clemson and Duke and that, all white. You see, so it wasn't just the Navy. And well, even the Air Force and the Army, they were slowly integrating.
Yeah, but not very much yet. They had some blacks in combat units, but segregated units still. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Now, when you were living up in Grand Rapids and you were up at the community college, I don't know, were there some blacks there, or?
Not one.
Okay.
There was, Creston High School had one black fellow. And I can't recall, when we went down, junior college, we played Highland Park in Detroit. They'd have some blacks on their team. But again, I played in the Southern Conference, and I never played against a black fellow. Then, of course, the blacks were coming up here and beating the southern schools. So the Southerners today, the blacks are just like all your major schools. The running backs and everything are all blacks.
Yeah, they all go for the best athletes.
Yeah.
Yeah. But at that time, they weren't doing that yet. All right. Now, how well informed were you about the progress of the war when you're on the ship? How much did you know about what was happening in the war?
Well, not too much. They had some woman, the Japanese called Tokyo Rose, and we really didn't get much news. The only news I remember when they dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Of course, the word went out over the address that we'd done that, and we didn't say, "Oh, what a terrible thing to do." We all cheered because we knew if we had to go into Japan, that we'd lose hundreds of thousands. That would, because the Japanese would, and that it only took two atomic bombs, and we had no casualties. And we, of course, in the military, the big thing is to inflict casualties but not take casualties, and so that was the thing. And of course, in the military too, it's almost better to wound people than to kill them, because wounding, that puts a responsibility to get these people out, and whereas if you kill them, it's ended. But even in the military, the infantry was pretty much man-to-man. But in the Navy, it just wasn't that. And on the landing craft, that was different. That was tough because you were taking the troops on shore. And so I attribute my Citadel background to the fact that I wound up on a capital ship and not a landing craft.
Right. Now, when you heard the news about the first atomic bomb, did you think right then that this might help end the war, or did you not make that connection yet?
Well, we were pretty sure it was going to do something because the report they told, we had never heard of the atomic bomb, and they told what it was, and the damage it did was so extensive, and we knew that, well, it didn't take the Japanese long to decide to get out of this thing.
All right. Now, while you were serving on the ship, one of the things that happened was you were assigned to protect the carrier Franklin. Now, did you see when the Franklin was hit, or did you just come in later?
I don't recall just where the Franklin was, but we were assigned to escort the Franklin out. It had to be towed. And so we would circle around the Franklin, and even then one kamikaze did get through, and they missed. But that was our job, was to get the Franklin out of there. The Franklin lost 1,000 or more men, and we took some of the wounded of the Franklin on board. Our ship had a fully equipped operating room on it. You know, it was like a city.
Yeah.
And we took several of the wounded from the Franklin on board. But I don't,
You need to turn that off, I
Give it
think.
up on me, I'm sorry. Oh. I put it on silent. I'm sorry.
It's okay.
Modern technology.
Right. You mentioned, okay, so you had some of the wounded from the Franklin on board your ship. And then what did you do with the Franklin, or where did you go?
Well, we got it back out, and then the tow ships took over and towed it back to the United States. And of course, they put it into and repaired it and that. But a carrier, they had this high octane gas in World War II, and it was just a floating gas can. And the big thing with a carrier was not the hit, but the fire caused by the gas being ignited.
Now, did you ever see any of the carriers being hit?
I can't recall. See, I was in the gun director, and
Right.
you're not up there looking around.
Yeah. So you can see a little bit in one direction or through the telescope, and that's about it? Okay. Now, do you have a sense of sort of how many kamikazes or bombers might come at you at once?
You what?
About how many kamikazes might be in an attack?
Well, single usually.
Okay.
Single. The Japanese, the Combat Air Patrol, they went in and bombed the airfields. They took out a lot of the Japanese planes right in the airfield on land.
So on land or before they got to the ships,
Yeah.
most of them were already gone.
Yeah.
So they come through one at a time if they make it. Okay. All right. Now, where were you when you heard about the Japanese surrender? You're out at sea somewhere?
In the Pacific.
Yeah. Okay. So you're out at sea at that point. I think this will probably tell
maybe
us.
that log tells where, but we were getting closer to invading Japan. Okay.
Off all the way there. Yeah. I guess you were at some point you were off Okinawa.
Pardon?
Were you near Okinawa maybe?
Well, Okinawa was past. We were getting closer to Japan itself.
Right. But Okinawa was still a major base.
Yeah, well, Leyte was our base. And Okinawa, and I drew a blank a little while ago. Okinawa was one of our original targets.
Right. Okay. I guess on the chronology here it says you're anchored at Buckner Bay in August, it's Okinawa, August of 45, and a couple days later the Japanese surrender. All right. Then it says from there you go from Okinawa with 7 Fleet Occupation Forces, and it has you going to Korea and then to China.
Well, we went to Tsingtao.
And
We were there a couple of months.
okay. And what were you doing there?
Well, sitting in the harbor, I went ashore with my friend Ludd and Walgren, he was an officer. And what I did in Ludd, we walked up around. Now, Tsingtao had some big homes in it, and the Japanese army that was there was in a compound. And Ludd and I were up walking through the hills there, and we even hired a rickshaw. A little guy, about 5'6", 120 pounds, and I was going to walk up a hill, and he was offended. He wouldn't let me walk up a hill. I felt, here I was 6'4" plus, 200 and some pounds, and this little guy hauling me. But anyway, Ludd and I were walking around up there, and there were 2 or 3 little Chinese girls, and they'd never seen a big American white. And I spoke to one. I said, do you speak English? And she, a little. You should meet my father. He speaks English well. So they showed us where they lived, and Ludd and I came back, and the man was a customs officer in Tsingtao. And we made a friendship with him. And then we'd go, when we went ashore, we'd go there, and Ludd was a good piano player. And they had one of these golden song books and an upright piano. And we'd gather around with the Chinese and sing, home on the range and that. And we'd take food from, and well, I saw one time a woman, probably in her 30s, but she looked like she was in her 60s, with 2 or 3 little kids sitting with her and taking the dirt from the street and putting it in a sieve. They'd come out of the sacks that the coolies would carry, and rice and corn, and she'd put that in a little pouch, take that home, and that would be their dinner that night. And it made me, I never complained about food, and I wouldn't let my children complain about food again. I always cited that for them. But I said to my friend, the customs officer, I said, doesn't that bother you? He had a big home and everything. And he said, when the Japanese occupied Tsingtao, it would take a year's salary to buy 100 pounds of flour. He said, what can I do? And I arranged a banquet for my division, and the captain let me take my whole division ashore, and other divisions had to fill in for us. And Mr. Shi, he got bankers and merchants and whatnot, about 20 Chinese businessmen, and we had a dinner, Chinese dinner. I got a menu there I gave you. And my men, they said it was one of their finest experiences they had. And I had to march them from the wharf up to the restaurant. Well, my men tried to outdrink the Chinese and they didn't win, they lost. And I had to march 100 and some drunken sailors back to the wharf to get them on board ship. But that's what I did. I would go to their house, and Lud and I, we'd take some food off the ship and bring it to them. But, and he spoke English real well.
Now, while you were there, did you have any sense of kind of what was going on in China?
Well, at night, the guns would be, the communists were up on the hills firing at night. While we could see the firing at night. They were already fighting.
And was your friend worried that they might come in or take over?
I can't recall discussing it with him, but we could see that. And we ate with some Chinese army officers and that, and we had some fellowship with them. We couldn't speak Chinese and they couldn't speak English, but somehow we managed to communicate.
All right. Now, what was the purpose of your ship being in Tsingtao?
Well, mainly to support the occupation of Tsingtao and accept the surrender of the Japanese there.
And so then did you leave when they shipped the Japanese out?
Pardon?
Did you leave Tsingtao when they shipped the Japanese out?
Well, I don't recall whether they did or not, but we did leave. And then we went, I'm not sure where we went, but we took about 1,000 troops with us too, on board. We had sailors and troops sharing bunks and that, and we had army men sleeping around the ship, but we took them back with us.
All right. And then where did you, so I guess in late 45 then you get to go home basically.
Well, you know, when I was a gunnery officer, so I was never on the bridge of the ship when it was underway.
Right.
Because of a gun station. And on the way back, I was on the bridge 2 or 3 times when the ship was underway, and the only maneuvers that took place, and I was just more of an observer, when we blew the tubes, we call it, but to get the soot out of the tube, we would turn the ship so the wind was coming cross ship rather than, and those were the only maneuvers. And when we stopped at Hawaii on the way back, and then we went to San Francisco. Well, when we left San Francisco, I went up to the watch board. A lot of the senior officers left the ship. They've been going to be discharged. And I went up to see what my watch would be. And I was the officer of the deck. That's the top on-watch officer of a ship with 2,000 men down. And I had the mid-watch from midnight to 4 o'clock in the morning. Everybody, including the captain, were all sleeping. And I never felt so inadequate in all my life. I was 25 years old, and this was several $100 million ship, and my experience was nil. And anyway, I had the mid-watch when we approached the Panama Canal. I had the mid-watch when we approached Boston Harbor, and I had the mid-watch when we approached New York Harbor. So as I reflect back, and I did show you my evaluation by Captain Grant, that they must have had some confidence in me. I know, well, one time we were up there and the radar reported, Mr. Damon, we've got an object and it's not moving and we're heading toward it. And of course, your radar goes a long ways because your bridge is up 100 feet above. And so the captain, when you're underway, sleeps right underneath the bridge. That's his sea cabin. He's got a pretty fancy cabin down below. So I called, I said, Captain Grant, this is Noble, this is the officer of the deck. Radar reports an object, and it's, I said, I'm sorry to bother you. He said, that's all right, that's what I'm here for. So he came right up. Well, we were heading toward an island. Well, the navigation officer, who was an Annapolis graduate, a commander, wanted to see if I did the wrong things. Well, I hadn't, and they straightened it out. So I guess it was quite a responsible position to put a kid 25 years old with the limited experience I had up, and all these guys sleeping down below, feeling safe.
But you didn't hit anything.
No.
Yeah. All right. So now you get back to the States. This is going to be now very end of the year in 45. And then once you're back to the States, you get into Boston, then you go down to New York. What happens with the ship then?
Well, we went to Bayonne, New Jersey, which was across the harbor from New York City. And the ship was ultimately mothballed. They put sealed over it, covered. It was taken out of action. It was. I left the ship in May or June of '46, and but the ship was being prepared for storage.
Right. So what were your duties then in those last months, once you're back in the States?
I don't know, just waiting to get out. We weren't doing anything because crews were covering with plastic and whatnot and spraying on and sealing up the guns and everything. And I don't know, just eat and sleep, go ashore in New York City.
Yeah. You know, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Okay. Now, did you give any thought to staying in the Navy, or were you just waiting to get out?
Well, Captain Grant, I showed you he wanted me to stay in. And I had already applied for law school at Michigan when I was out in the Pacific, and I'd been accepted. And I told him, I said, well, Captain, I've always wanted to be, since I was in elementary school, be a lawyer, and I've been admitted. And so he said, well, he wanted me to make the Navy my career. And so I thanked him graciously, and so that was it.
All right. So then you leave the Navy in '46. Then did you start up law school that fall?
No, started 2 weeks later.
Okay.
I went to summer school, my first summer at law school.
Very good. All right. And then did you then go back to Grand Rapids to practice law, or what did you do?
Well, I came back here when I graduated, yes. My first job was in the city attorney's office. And I was the assistant and then a deputy, and ultimately I was the city attorney when Paul Goebel was a mayor. In fact, I was the chairman of 3 mayor election campaigns. But it soured me on turning things over to the government to run. No, I didn't want to spend my life in the city hall. So I left and went into private practice.
All right. Now, when you look back over the time that you spent in the Navy, how do you think that affected you, or what did you learn from it?
I don't know that I was just doing my duty that I was trained to do, any more than how what you're doing affecting you, And as I say, the Navy is quite impersonal. It's very mechanical, and the human element, just like today with computers, you still the human element there, but I have good memories. In fact, it's very hard for me to realize that I was all over the Pacific and in China and Tsingtao and Leyte in the Philippines and you know, because you're at sea just about all the time.
Mm-hmm.
But I enjoyed the Navy. I really did, and that's more than a lot of the reserve officers didn't. Because, but I'm thankful. I'm building up the Citadel now, but I'm thankful for my Citadel background. And in fact, I'll say this with a certain amount of reserve that Captain Grant, who was an Annapolis graduate, rated me in the top % of the officers he'd ever commanded. And I attribute that to my Citadel background. And so many of these fellows coming out of Hope and Kelvin and Hillsdale, that, you know, they didn't have that background.
Right.
And the Citadel was tough. Not many people want to go through that. Although they're getting more applications now, they have openings, even today. But no, I enjoyed the Navy very much. I wasn't just counting the days till I got out, but I did want to go to law school. And I'm somewhat embarrassed even to be here, Jim, because I don't feel very heroic. It was such an easy life for me. We never got hit, you know.
Well, you know, the point of all of this larger project is to learn about all of the different stories and the different kinds of experiences. So it's not just the people who were under fire all the time, it was everybody else. You had a job to do,
Yeah.
you went and you did it, and you're able to tell us, you
As
know.
I said, the Navy is like a hospital or like Fifth Third Bank. You know, you got mortgage people, you got estate investment, you got tellers at the, you know, and it's a unit, and it's not individualized, and it's a team thing, and that's why we have gunnery practice and that, and loading, and that it's just dry runs. We did some shooting, but it's just to develop skills, just like your football and basketball practice and that was what the Navy was like, much like that. It's just because you got 2,000 plus men operating as a unit.
Yeah. And that in itself is something worth communicating and understanding. All right. Well, I'd like to close the interview here just by thanking you for coming in and talking to me today.
Well, I feel inadequate. As I look back, it's hard for me to realize that God has been good to me, Jim. You know, I'm in my 92nd year, and I'm just thankful. And as I say, I'm a little embarrassed because, well, as I say, I baked Alaska, and then I told my wife that, and she said, here, I was going without nylon stockings, so you fellows could have baked Alaska.
There you go.
I never seen such desolation. I think we drove for a mile and there wasn't a building hardly standing.
Nobody knew what was going on. They called the situation fluid, but fluid means that nobody knew anything.
It was different. If I had done something else, I don't know what I would have done.